Guys, gals, non-binary pals, welcome to Rhyme Signatures, my little lovely hole on the internet where I decide to talk about various things about music. Now, today I wanted to do a topic I've been thinking long and hard about, and that is what I consider to be my personal top 10 records of all time. Insert, like, clapping noises and cheering sound effect here, I guess. Yes, everybody, I really wanted to do this for a while. Now, I am going to preface this by saying that my top 10 is not going to be indicative of your top 10, and that is absolutely fine. So don't get too excited when I don't include things like, spoilers, Dark Side of the Moon, Close to the Edge, Led Zeppelin 4, Songs in the Key of Life, Blonde on Blonde, blah, 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 blah. You know, the usual Rolling Stone stuff that always makes people's top 10. Whatever. If those are your top 10s of all time, then amazing, love that for you, but it ain't mine. So I got to thinking what really constitutes including one particular record on this top 10, and it's honestly kind of hard to really sort of quantify it in terms of like how I've articulated all this in my head, so I didn't think too hard about it, let's put it that way. I didn't think too hard about it. I just went with my gut, went with what felt right, and I will say that apart from maybe the top 3 or so, pretty much everything on this list is kind of interchangeable, you know, 8 might become 6, 10 might become 7, whatever, it doesn't really matter, apart from the last 3, which are very much set in stone. So, without any further ado, let's take a little bit of a look at what I consider to be my 10 favourite albums of all time, and exactly why. Okay, at number 10, Deafheaven's Sunbather. Oh yes, I love Sunbather, love it, love it, love it, love it, love it. Now, before that album ever came out, I was kind of on the whole, like, black metal thing. It just wasn't for me. I didn't really vibe it at all. And as cliche as it might be to say that, oh, Sunbather's not real black metal, I'm like, I don't care. It opened the doors for me. It showed me that I actually do like that kind of music, you know? It really opened up my eyes, or ears, as the case may be, to what that kind of sound could do and how it could affect me personally. There's just something about the extraordinary blend of these guttural, inhuman vocals coupled with some of the most gorgeous, spacey, skyscraping guitar sounds I've ever heard, you know? I mean, there's tremolo picking and then there's Sunbather, am I right, you know? And, just everything about it just really ticks my buttons, you know? Every time I think to myself I'm over it or the hype's died down, I put it on again and I just love it. I love it all over again. And I will never forget my first time hearing it, but even now to this day, I don't know, it still feels like I can hear it for the first time again every single time I press play. It just blows my mind every single time I hear it, and I absolutely love it. Number 9, we're going a little bit further back in time, but not by much. It is Haken with their debut album, Aquarius. Now, yeah, I know, this isn't everybody's favourite Haken record, I know, and I get that, and I see that, you know, most people will go for The Mountain, or maybe Affinity, but rarely do people choose Aquarius, because obviously, it's the first album, it feels like, you know, they were kind of just finding their feet a little bit, maybe. Perhaps you consider them to be too much of a Dream Theater clone at this point in their career, I don't know. All I can remember is when I first found this band, I think it was, God, how did I find them again? Might have been Prog Archives, I was like browsing Prog Archives back in like 2010. And this little band, this little record was like sitting pretty at like 4.6 out of 5 or something ridiculous like that. It was really, really high. And I was in such a Dream Theater is the best band ever, nobody will ever be better than them, yada, yada, yada. I was just like blinded, you know, blinkers were on for Dream Theater at this point in my life. So then Haken comes along, and within about the first couple of minutes, I think, of the point of no return, I was like, oh, hello, you know? Suddenly I could feel the endorphins firing, and I was like, oh, yeah, okay, this is going places, you know. And when Ross Jennings comes into it, and he drops that, until the ice has melted, I'm like, oh, yeah, okay, I get it. And I was hooked. I had listened to this album dozens of times that year, like on repeat, non-stop. I just couldn't get enough. And to this day, I don't think any of Haken's records have ever hit me as hard as Aquarius did. And I think just because of how well and how established it became in my brain, I really struggle to think of any other of their records that deserve to be my top 10 of all time. So, big love to Aquarius, wonderful album. Thank God we found this band. At number 8, we have got the magnificent Ziltoid the Omniscient by none other than Devin Townsend. Now again, this was not my first exposure to Devin Townsend, more on that later, but this was certainly the first full-length album of his that I ever listened to. You know, I didn't really get the strapping young lad thing at the time. It wasn't really for me, per se. And the whole Devin Townsend band, with things like Physicist, Terrier, you know, all that usual sort of stuff from there. I discovered that much later, and I love that stuff, don't get me wrong, but Ziltoid was my first love, my first real love when it came to Devin's music. It's just outstanding. I just found it so funny at the time, you know? I was really kind of just like dipping my toes into concept albums at the time, not really sure where I stood with them. And all it really took was the ridiculous idea of a coffee-obsessed, neurotic alien nerd who wanted to just destroy the world if they didn't bring them the finest cup of black coffee, you know? And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. But beyond the humour, you know, beyond the silliness and the ridiculous nature of the narrative, there's so much punchy instrumentation on here which really just took my breath away. There were so many catchy moments on here. So many parts of this album really do continue to thrill me, even now, so many years after I first listened to it. I mean, try not to get hyped by Ziltoidia Attacks. It's such a big song, and then following it up with the likes of Hyperdrive, which was obviously covered later on I think it was Addicted, I think. Oh gosh, I'm going to get crucified if people realise that I'm getting the wrong album on this one. One of the DTP albums when Anneke van Giersbergen covered it on the vocals, but I always come back to the OG. I love this record so much. Wasn't as big on Z Squared. It's fine. You know, it's fine, but I really do feel that the original holds up remarkably well, whereas I think Z Squared can feel a little bit, okay, we get it, you know? Ziltoid as a character was fun as a one-off, but I think he should just be kept in his bubble, you know, kept in this particular instance, in this particular album, but what do I know? Whatever I want to say about this record, it's absolutely phenomenal, wonderful piece of work, and if you've not listened to it, absolutely do check this one out, because as far as I'm concerned, it's one of Townsend's best works, and it opened up my eyes to a whole new side of music when I listened to this, so hell yeah. At number 7, we have got Act 4, Rebirth in Reprise by the Deer Hunter. Now, this was I'm noticing a familiar theme to actually some of these records. You know, this is my first exposure to the Deer Hunter. This is the first time I ever listened to them, at least properly, at least. I think I heard a couple of songs off of the Colour Spectrum before I heard this, and I was like, hey, it's kind of okay, you know, kind of like it, whatever. But again, it was a recommendation from a friend back in the day, and I don't remember who it was, so if it was you, thank you so much for setting me on this dark path. I love it. But somebody recommended this to me, and I wasn't so sure at first, you know, because I wasn't really into... I know this sounds so juvenile and petty of me. I wasn't into the indie rock side of the prog rock thing, you know. I wasn't into that. I was, at the time, I was darkness and metal, you know, and this basically doesn't have any of that on it. There's no darkness, there's no metal, there's no nothing. It's just quaint, pleasant, beautifully formed, immaculately produced progressive indie rock. But it hit me. It hit me so hard. It was like an absolute... bullet to the head, what have I been doing with my life where I've been avoiding this kind of music? You know, this was a real handbrake turn, you know. This was a suddenly, I've seen the light on the other side of the road, this is the album that's going to light the way to me, and I've never looked back. I've been obsessed with the Deer Hunter ever since. I have listened to the entire Act series more times than I can count. I intend to do a full re-listen once every 2 or 3 months. You know, from Act 1 all the way through Act 5, praying eventually maybe we'll get the hanged man of Act 6, but hey, who knows? But Act 4 was very special to me, and even after the superb Act 5, Hymns with the Devil and Confessional, I always came back to Rebirth in Reprise, because not just because it was the first one for me, but because I felt it was the most fully realised version of the band, you know. Before that, you had... Act 1, kind of like an intro, whatever. Act 2, which felt very much kind of mired in the emo and kind of like traditional indie rock side of things. You had Act 3, which was starting to feel a bit more theatrical, and the big break between 3 and 4. And then when this came out, and it was basically part musical theatre, part prog rock, part indie rock, it just snap, boom, light switched on my brain, and I've never looked back. Adore this record. Please check this one out. It's absolutely untouchable. One of the all-time greats. Okay, number 6. Now, I was a little bit torn with this position because the same artist, kinda, was going to feature at this point, and it was a case of, do I choose the solo project work or do I choose the band work that he's most well known for? And ultimately, I had to ask myself, which of these do I think I will hold in higher regard in 10 years' time? And ultimately, I came down to the solo work. So, at number 6, we have Hand Cannot Erase by Steven Wilson. Now, like I say, the other alternative for this would have been Deadwing by Porcupine Tree, but like I say, I just think this one's aging better, you know? I love Deadwing, I really, really do, but it's got a little tiny hint of juvenility about it. Only a tiny bit, mind you, little sliver of juvenility. And that's no disrespect to Steven or anybody else in Porcupine Tree whatsoever. It's just that I think that this particular project landed so well and so heavily for me that even The Mighty Raven That Refused to Sing, you know, the predecessor to this, can't hold up to it in terms of how I feel about this in my ranking position. I have wept to this album more times than I care to remember. I get to Happy Returns towards the very end of the album, and I struggled to sing along to it as much as I want to, because it's so heartbreaking. It's such a heartbreaking album. It's incredibly beautiful, to the point where even just thinking about certain parts of it really, really just tear me up, you know. There's just honestly, Ninette Tayeb's vocals on this are just spellbinding, and I've never heard a better pairing than between her and Steven. They just work so well as a dynamic between the two of them on so many of the tracks on here. And it's just superb. It's superb. I would say, for me personally, across this entire discography, both solo and Porcupine Tree and all the various other projects, you know, even the likes of Bass Communion or Blackfield or whatever else he's been up to these days, this is the one that goes on the pedestal. This is the pinnacle of Steven Wilson's work. I don't think this will ever be bettered, or even equaled, quite frankly, by him, but I'm kind of okay with that, because as long as this remains at the top of the pile, I can always hold it in that high regard. Okay, we're into the top 5 now, and this next one, again, similar situation to Steven Wilson. This was a case of, do I choose the band they're most well known for, or do I go down the solo career? And once again, the solo career won over. Now, the album in question is Sola Scriptura by Neal Morse. Now, yeah, this is an album that came to me at a very, very important time in my life. You know, it was 2007 this came out, and I heard this after thoroughly enjoying Neal's work on the likes of Spock's Beard and what have you. You know, Snow was ruling my life. It was one of the most important albums I've ever listened to. Absolutely superb. Nearly managed its spot here, but again, lost out to the solo work. And I was on the lead up to my finals at uni. You know, I was studying my little backside off for all this sort of thing, and in between studying or during studying, I kind of had this playing at all times, you know. It was like God, what's the best way of putting it? This was my comfort album. This was the album I used to ground myself when I was feeling mentally burnt out. The album I used to remind myself of what I was doing there. You know, why was I studying for this? Why was this important to me? It all came down to Sola Scriptura. In no uncertain way of putting it, it showed me the light, you know. I mean, this is obviously an album with deeply religious connotations, being, of course, the story of Martin Luther nailing his 95 thesis or whatever it was onto the wall, all about that. And I found it fascinating. It was a lyrically brilliant, musically dense, and sonically complicated album. And it's 4 tracks, you know. You've got the 2 massive 20-minute plus epics, including like The Door, which is nearly 30 minutes long. The little Heaven in My Heart, and then obviously finishing off on the conclusion. It stuck with me. It really got me through a lot, this album. And every time I listen to it, I get that nostalgic twinge of the life that I had before all of this, you know, before everything went crazy after graduating and I went into the wonderful, wonderful world of, like, paid employment and living and all that jazz and mortgages, way. No, Sola Scriptura always brings me back. It reminds me of innocent times. It reminds me of being a young man in their 20s, struggling to find their place in the world, and using this kind of music to really guide me to find out who I was and what I really wanted to do with my life. And for that reason, Sola Scriptura has to have a part in my top 10 of all time. Right, top 4, we're getting interesting now. It is time for Ayreon with the Human Equation. Yeah, Ayreon's Human Equation. I recently did a chit-chat with Notes over on their channel about Into the Electric Castle, which I love, you know, unquestionably, but it's not quite S-tier Ayreon for me. There are a couple of little tiny nitpicks I have with it. The Human Equation I have no such nitpicks with, you know? This record, I have actually done a classics review of this one like a couple of years back now, so you might want to go and check that one out to get my like full thoughts and excitement about it. But yeah, this record was the gateway drug for me. This is what threw the doors open, you know? There was all that progressive rock, all that progressive metal out there, and again at the time I was a Dream Theater kiddie. I was like, you know, DT for life, nobody else can compare to this band, yada yada yada. But Ayreon got my attention because James LaBrie, my man James LaBrie, was on this album, and I was like, ooh, if Kevin James can be on this record, then, you know, I've got to listen to it, you know, I've got to listen to it. But it was through this album that I discovered so many other progressive metal bands at this formative time in my life, you know. Let's have a look who's on here. James LaBrie, Mikael Åkerfeldt, Eric Clayton, Heather Findlay, Irene Jansen, Magnus Ekvall, Devon Graves, Marcella Bovio, Arjen Lucassen, Mike Baker, Devin Townsend, and Ed Warby. Now, I mentioned earlier with Ziltoid that it wasn't my first exposure to Devin, because this was right there, Devin Townsend right there. Same with Mikael Åkerfeldt and Opeth, and same with Mike Baker and Shadow Gallery. I cannot stress the importance of this album. Without this, I probably wouldn't be making a top 10 progressive metal albums of all time for me, because frankly I discovered so much of my music taste because of the Human Equation. It was such an important record, and it's not just about who's on it, what they did, how they affected me. This is a damn good album musically as well. There's so many interesting things on this album to just... Every little part of this is different, but somehow manages to feel so complete, you know? There's so much going on, and I just absolutely adore this album. This is just premium progressive metal. It's perfect in every single way as far as I'm concerned, and if you're on the fence about the genre in general, give this a spin. Check out the bands from the various guest vocalists. I guarantee you, if you're anything like me, you're gonna have a great time, and you're gonna find so much more new music through this. Okay, right, here we go, big leagues. These top three, like I've said, are removable. This is the order in which they exist. Everyone else before can be swapped around, but not these three. So the top three, that's it. This is the order. Let's go. Dream Theater's Scenes from a Memory. Yep. We love Dream Theater, we love Scenes from a Memory. Now, this album's special. This album is very, very special to me. Now, in my discography ranking of Dream Theater, I did put this at number 1, I think. It was either that or Awake. And I am still torn to this day as to which of those two I prefer. It's Awake or it's Scenes from a Memory. But when I was coming up with this list, I did originally have Awake in this list, you know? I did originally have it there at number 3, but then I thought to myself, no. And there's a reason why this album is so important to me. When I finished university and I was looking for a place to live, I went and stayed with my nan. And I stayed there for 4 months. I was there for 4 months whilst I was house hunting, and she took me in, she looked after me, she did so much for me, you would not believe. But it was a small house, I was like a 21-year-old man, I still needed some independence, whatever, and the only thing that I had, you know, the only thing that I really had, which was like mine and really gave me some time to myself, was my CD player. You know, my little portable CD player that I had. It had these tinny little speakers. It was blocky, it was terrible, but it was mine, you know? I had very little in the way of, like, personal assets at the time, and I had that. And I had my CD collection, and I'd recently picked this one up. And this was the first Dream Theater album I actually bought myself, you know? I had listened to A Change of Seasons prior to that, which, you know, really set me on to the band. But this was the first album of theirs that I actually physically bought, and I spent 4 months pretty much obsessing over this. Dissecting the characters, analysing the story, appreciating the various nuances to the musical leitmotifs, etc., blah, 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 blah. You know, you get it. But it's because of the association that I have with this record with my nan, you know, now. She passed away late last year, so fairly recently. And, you know, every time I listen to this record, every time I spin this, you know, she's there, you know, I always think of her, you know, and it's a nice way for me to remember her by, you know, and it's very important to me as a result, because the scenes from a memory that I get from this album are of her. You know, she's just there. She's caring for me. She's helping me. She's doing everything she can to be there for me at a time in my life which was very, very difficult indeed. You know, a very challenging part of my life. And this album, you know, connects me to her still, even now. So, very important album. Love it to bits, and I miss you every day. Right, number 2, we have got Opeth's Blackwater Park. Oh, baby Opeth. Yes, 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 yes. We love a bit of Opeth. We do. Well, I certainly do, at least. Anyway, Opeth was one of those bands that it did take me a while to get into them. I'm not going to try and pretend otherwise, because again, I went through a long period of time where I wasn't really into like growled vocals or death metal or angry stuff. You know, it wasn't me. I was very clean. I was very immaculate production, you know, boy bandy vocals. You know, the cleaner side of progressive metal. I didn't like the dank. I didn't like the dirt. I was like, ugh, you know, I wasn't kind of into that sort of thing. But again, because of Airion's The Human Equation, I learnt about Mikael Åkerfeldt and heard how he sings from a clean perspective, you know? And I was like, ooh, that's a lovely voice. Let's listen to some more Opeth, shall we? And I can't remember what the very first Opeth album I listened to properly was. It might have been Ghost Reveries. I don't honestly remember. But what I do remember was listening to Still Life and thinking, you know what? I love this side of this sort of side of progressive metal, this kind of heaviness, this really angry, dirgy, scary side of metal. But it was a little bit too much for me at the time. You know, it was a bit intense. But then I picked this one up, Blackwater Park, and it was a brilliant, superb, absolutely faultless offering showcasing the both sides of the coin. You've got the bleak, introspective, beautiful songs like Harvest. Then you've got the dank, dirgy, horrifying stuff like the final title track of Blackwater Park, which is, for my money, one of the best songs literally of all time. And it was a perfect blend. It was an absolutely immaculate blend of both light and dark. And to this day, I am convinced this is the album which was instrumental in me branching out into the darker side of metal, you know. And I love it 100%. I will never not adore this album. And it's only beaten to the post by one. Now, anybody who knows me or has watched my channel for at least a little bit of a time now, you know what number 1 is. So I'm not going to spoil it for anybody whose first time it is here. But for those who don't know, let's look at number 1 of my favourite albums of all time. It is Colours by Between the Buried and Me. Oh, baby, yes. Now, if Blackwater Park was my introduction, my graduation, if you will, into the world of extreme progressive metal, then Colours was most assuredly my championing of it. Now, I've talked about this album and what it means to me a fair bit on this channel, but I'll sort of like recap, you know. I hated this record when I first listened to it. I thought it was trash. I thought it was absolute garbage. I couldn't stand Tommy's vocals. I thought it was too much, too in your face, too overwhelming, and I just hated it. I just thought it was throw it in the bin, it's a load of rubbish, not got any time for this whatsoever. I just didn't care, you know, like get rid of it, whatever. As the years went on, I kept thinking about it, you know. I kept thinking to myself, you know, everybody talks about how good this album is. Everybody's constantly going on about colours this, colours that, blah, 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 you know. And how Between the Buried and Me are like the darlings of the progressive metal world right now. And I still didn't hear it, you know. But one day I just sat down. I thought, you know what, screw it. I'm going to give it another try. I'm going to see if it clicks. And I don't know what was different. I don't know what I did differently. I don't know what I was thinking differently. But something changed. There was a change in the water, and there was a change in how I heard this album. And everything that I previously thought to myself, nah, I was like, hell yeah. And it was amazing. Absolutely astonishing. It remains to this day one of the most transformative experiences in my musical life. Nothing has reached me the way Colours has done. There is something about this album which, from the very opening moments of, you know, Foamborn, I am immediately goosebumped straight away because I know what's coming. I know what is coming, what to anticipate, what is about to unfurl out of my speakers, and every single time it thrills me. That's ultimately what it comes down to. When I think about this album, I am excited to listen to it. I've listened to this hundreds upon hundreds of times, possibly. I don't even know. I've lost count of the number of times I've spammed this record. It's easily over 100 times. And every single time, I find something new to be excited about. I am reminded every single time why this album hits me as hard as it does. And there has been nothing else on this earth, no other musical production of any form, function, or style, which has ever been able to do a complete 180 on me like Colours has done, to go from something I genuinely hated to being what I consider to be the best, most complete, most exciting and brilliant record across any genre of all time. And so there we have it. That is my pick for the top 10 albums of all time. Now, I know, I've not included XYZ, I've not included ABC or 123 or whatever. That's fine. Nobody says that my list has to match yours or have any correlation whatsoever to any other list on the internet. This is, after all, my list. But, as is always with these things, and of course to drive engagement, I'd love to hear about what your top 10 albums of all time are, and I do genuinely mean that, because I always love to discover new things, and if it's your favourite of all time, then it's got to be amazing, right? Surely it's got to be amazing, so I'd love to know what they are. Please drop them down below in the comments, let's get a conversation going, and if you have watched this far, guys, as always, thank you so very much for watching, and you know what's coming. Until next time, keep your rhyme signatures pretty odd.